The following is an exploration of different historical narratives and theories surrounding the Manson case. Some of the topics discussed are disturbing and include complex, unproven theories. The goal of this channel is to examine the evidence presented for all sides, not to endorse any single conclusion. Hello, and welcome to the Fairshake Files. Today, we are going to explore a story that many of us think we know. It's a story that has been told for 50 years, a story that in many ways came to define the end of an era. It involves the glamour of Hollywood, the idealism of the 1960s counterculture, and a series of crimes so brutal they seem to defy explanation. This is the story of Charles Manson and his family. The version we have been told is one of a charismatic cult leader who brainwashed his followers into committing murder. And while that version contains elements of the truth, it is far from the whole story. It's a narrative that was carefully constructed, legally necessary, and commercially successful. But it may have obscured a more complex and disturbing reality. In this account, we will journey through 3 distinct narratives, each supported by a different interpretation of the evidence. First, we will explore in detail the official story, the one presented in a courtroom and sold to the world as Helter Skelter. We will examine the evidence and the logic that led to the conviction of Charles Manson as the architect of one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Then, with a critical eye, we will look closely at the cracks in that official story. We will investigate the simpler, more logical motives that were known to investigators, but were ultimately sidelined. We will explore a world of drug deals, criminal rivalries, and copycat killings that paints a very different picture of the Manson family. And finally, we will consider the most unsettling possibility of all, that the Manson family was not an isolated phenomenon, but was instead an intersection point, a bloody nexus connected to a secret, undeclared war being waged by the United States government against its own citizens. We will delve into the documented realities of programs like MKUltra and COINTELPRO and examine the troubling coincidences and circumstantial evidence that suggest Charles Manson may have been less of a mastermind and more of a monster manufactured in the shadows. This is not a story of simple good versus evil. It is a story about how history is made, how narratives are built, and how the truth can be far more complex and far more frightening than the legends that contain it. Part 1. The Tinderbox. The world that made Manson. Before we can understand the man, we must first understand the world that created him. The 1960s in America were not merely a backdrop for his crimes, but the very crucible in which the conditions for his rise were forged. It was a time of profound conflict, a society tearing at its own seams. The source of this conflict was a schism, a deep and widening chasm that separated the generations. This generation gap was fueled by a unique confluence of demographic and economic factors. The post-World War II baby boom produced the largest youth cohort in the nation's history. 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964. They came of age during a period of unparalleled economic prosperity. Unlike their parents, whose values were forged in the crucibles of the Great Depression and the patriotic certainty of World War II, this new generation had known only affluence. This economic security, which provided disposable income and expanded access to higher education, paradoxically enabled them to challenge the very foundations of the society they were set to inherit. The values of their parents, hard work, institutional religion, material success, seemed hollow, even hypocritical, when viewed against the backdrop of deep-seated racial injustice, and the escalating, televised horror of the Vietnam War. A new consciousness was dawning, and it had its own language: rock and roll. Artists like Bob Dylan and the Beatles became the poets of this rebellion, their lyrics dissected for meaning, their music the soundtrack for a cultural revolution. This sense of disillusionment was the fertile ground in which the counterculture grew. It was a search for a new way of living, for a new kind of community, for something authentic in a world that felt increasingly plastic and false. This search found its symbolic heart in a small neighborhood in San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury district. In 1967, this neighborhood became a magnet for as many as 100,000 young people during what the media dubbed the Summer of Love. It was a massive, utopian experiment in communal living, artistic expression, and personal freedom, guided by the principle of rejecting consumerism and embracing shared experience. Groups like the Diggers, a radical community action group, provided free food, turning political protest into a form of public service. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if a new, more compassionate society was possible. But the dream of the Haight-Ashbury was short-lived, and its collapse was brutal. The sheer number of arrivals overwhelmed the community. The ideals of peace and love quickly gave way to the harsh realities of overcrowding, poverty, and rampant crime. Hard drugs, particularly amphetamines and heroin, replaced the psychedelics that had once promised enlightenment, bringing with them violence and addiction. The ethos of free love curdled into exploitation. The Diggers, a local community group, grimly noted that the ideals of the movement had decayed into a harsh reality where exploitation and violence became commonplace. The utopia had collapsed into a predatory environment. It left thousands of disillusioned and vulnerable young people stranded, many of them teenage runaways, disconnected from their families, all of them looking for a leader, for a family that could offer them the safety and purpose the world had failed to provide. It was into this environment, a failed paradise filled with lost children, that a 32-year-old man named Charles Manson arrived in 1967, having just been released from prison after spending nearly half his life behind bars. Parallel to this social decay, a hidden war was being waged. In the halls of power, the counterculture was not seen as a youth movement, but as a subversive threat to national security. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was running a series of secret and illegal operations known collectively as COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program. Its documented mission was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize any group considered politically objectionable. Using tactics ranging from planting false media stories to inciting violence between rival groups, COINTELPRO targeted civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., student activists, and the entire anti-war movement. Their greatest stated fear was the rise of a messiah who could unify these disparate factions into a cohesive revolutionary force. The existence of this program is not a theory, it is a documented fact, confirmed by the U.S. Senate's Church Committee in the 1970s. This climate of legitimate, state-sponsored paranoia is essential to understanding the darker narratives that would later emerge around the Manson case. It proves that the counterculture's deepest fears, that they were being watched, manipulated, and targeted by their own government, were not unfounded. It was in this tinderbox of cultural rebellion, social decay, and secret warfare that the fuse of the Manson family was lit. Part 2. The Official Narrative. Helter Skelter. The story of Charles Manson that the world came to know was the one told by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. It is a powerful and coherent narrative, one that provided a seemingly complete explanation for a set of crimes that were, on their surface, incomprehensible. In the sweltering August of 1969, Los Angeles was a city teetering on the edge of a cultural precipice. The discovery of two brutal, seemingly unrelated massacres within 48 hours plunged the city into a state of paranoid terror. At 10050 Cielo Drive, the pregnant actress Sharon Tate and 4 others, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, aspiring screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and a young visitor named Stephen Parent, were found savagely murdered. The next night, across town, supermarket executive Tate-LaBianca and his wife Rosemary met a similarly gruesome fate. The scenes were not just violent, they were ritualistic, adorned with cryptic messages scrawled in the victim's blood. The central thesis of the prosecution was that Charles Manson, a man who physically killed no one during these events, was nonetheless the undisputed architect of the slaughter. The state's challenge was to prove that Manson's ideology, his words, and his absolute psychological control constituted an overt act of conspiracy, making him as legally and morally culpable as those who wielded the knives and guns. To build this case, Bugliosi first had to construct the image of the manipulator. He argued that Manson's life in correctional institutions was a perverse university where he systematically mastered the arts of control. By the time he was released from Terminal Island in 1967, at age 32, he had spent roughly half his life behind bars. It was there, Bugliosi contended, that Manson undertook a deliberate course of self-education in psychological warfare. He became an obsessive student of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, not for self-improvement, but to learn the art of subtle persuasion, mastering techniques to make his targets feel his ideas were their own. He delved into Scientology while in prison, completing over 150 hours of auditing, a process that he learned could be used to probe for and exploit psychological vulnerabilities. And he drew from his experience as a pimp, honing techniques to target vulnerable young women, isolate them from their support systems, and foster complete, crippling dependency. He emerged from the prison system not as a reformed criminal, but as a highly skilled predator, armed with a unique arsenal of manipulative tools. The Haight-Ashbury district, teeming with disaffected runaways, was his perfect hunting ground. He preyed on young women and a few men from middle-class backgrounds who were disconnected from their families. He used a methodical process of indoctrination to forge what became known as the Manson family. He would begin by love-bombing new recruits, showering them with the unconditional acceptance and affection they craved. First-hand accounts from former members consistently describe how Manson had an almost supernatural ability to see their deepest insecurities and reflect back an image of themselves as beautiful, important, and loved. He would then move to the second stage, systematic isolation. He moved his growing commune away from the city, first to a dilapidated school bus, and later to remote, rustic locations like the Spawn Movie Ranch, an old film set in the hills of Los Angeles County. Here, he cut them off from their families, from old friends, from newspapers, from all outside influence. Their entire world became the family, and their entire frame of reference became Charlie. The final stage, according to the prosecution, was ego stripping. Manson used high doses of LSD, not as a tool for spiritual exploration, but as a weapon. He would conduct long, rambling sermons while his followers were under the influence of the drug, a state of extreme suggestibility. He broke down their mental defenses, their sense of self, their ability to question. Into this psychological void, he poured his own bizarre ideology. He taught them that he was a reincarnation of Jesus Christ and Satan, combined in one being. He taught them that death was an illusion, that they could do no wrong. His word became their law. As many of his followers, like Leslie Van Houten, would later testify, they simply did not question him. They believed that whatever he told them to do was, by definition, right. With his followers' minds prepared, Manson gave them a motive, a grandiose, apocalyptic prophecy he called Helter Skelter. He became obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, released in late 1968. He believed the band members were prophets, speaking directly to him through their lyrics, warning of an impending violent race war. He twisted the lyrics of songs to fit his vision. George Harrison's Piggies, a critique of the upper class, became a literal reference to the establishment pigs who needed to be slaughtered. He interpreted Blackbird, a song about the civil rights movement, as a call for Black people to rise up and begin the killing. He believed Helter Skelter, with its chaotic energy, was the name of the war itself. His plan, as presented by the prosecution, was for the family to commit a series of shocking, gruesome murders of wealthy white people. They were to stage the crime scenes to make it appear as though they had been committed by Black revolutionaries, specifically mentioning the Black Panthers. This, he believed, would ignite the war. The family would wait out the ensuing chaos in a mythical, bottomless pit in Death Valley. After the war was over and the Black population had proven incapable of governing, Manson and his family would emerge to rule the world. By the summer of 1969, Manson grew impatient that the race war hadn't started on its own, and he told his followers it was time for the family to show them how it was done. On the night of August 8, 1969, he sent 4 of his most loyal followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to the house at 150 Cielo Drive. Kasabian, who would later become the state's star witness, drove the car. According to her testimony, Manson's instructions were to totally destroy everyone in it, as gruesome as you can, and to leave a sign, something witchy. The resulting murders were a horrific fulfillment of that command. The killers left their intended calling card, the word pig, written in Sharon Tate's blood on the front door. The following night, Manson, dissatisfied with the sloppiness of the first crime, went along himself. He led a second group to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. He entered the home and tied up the couple before leaving, instructing his followers to go inside and commit the murders. There, the prophecy was written on the walls in the victim's blood. Death to pigs, rise, and a misspelled Helter Skelter on the refrigerator door. The prosecution's case was built on 3 interlocking pillars that made this bizarre story legally tenable. The first was the star witness, Linda Kasabian. Because she had not physically participated in the killings, she was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, which provided a direct, first-hand account of Manson's commands and his orchestration of the crimes. The second was the jailhouse confession of Susan Atkins to her cellmates, where she chillingly described her role in the murders and explained the Helter Skelter motive. The third was the forensic trail, fingerprints belonging to Krenwinkel and Watson found at the Tate residence, and the ballistics evidence linking the same .22 caliber revolver to both crime scenes. Together, these pillars constructed a powerful and coherent narrative. It convinced the jury, who found Manson guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. And through Bugliosi's multi-million-copy best-selling book, it convinced the world. It was a story of a modern-day Svengali, a charismatic monster who had turned flower children into killers, and in doing so, had single-handedly brought the dream of the 1960s to a violent and terrifying end. Part 3. Cracks in the Foundation. The Helter Skelter narrative offered the prosecution a simple solution to a complex legal problem. Charles Manson hadn't personally killed anyone at either crime scene. To convict him of first-degree murder, they needed conspiracy, a motive so large it could turn philosophy into law. A personal dispute would never tie him to the violence. An apocalyptic race war could. That idea became the bridge connecting Manson to every knife, every bullet, every word written in blood. Legally, it worked. Publicly, it became legend. But when we set aside the courtroom script and follow the evidence, a quieter, more plausible story begins to surface. One about a failed record deal, a prosecutor's ambition, and a sequence of crimes that make far more sense in the light of day. Before the murders, Manson believed music would save him. Through Beach Boy Dennis Wilson, he met producer Terry Melcher, son of Doris Day. Melcher visited Spahn Ranch, listened to Manson's songs, and discussed a possible album. But the deal evaporated. Melcher walked away, citing Manson's volatility. The rejection shattered Manson's self-image. He had promised his followers fame. When that dream collapsed, his preaching turned bitter. The man who once sang about freedom began to talk about vengeance against the people who had taken what he thought was his due. It was the first clear crack in his reality. When ambition failed, ideology took its place. And that vengeance had a specific address. The house at 10,050 Cielo Drive, where Sharon Tate and her friends were murdered, was not random. It was the house Terry Melcher had been renting until just months earlier. Manson had been there. He knew exactly whose home it had been. If the prosecution insisted the victims were random, the counter-argument is that the house was the target. A direct message of terror aimed at the man who rejected him, regardless of who lived there now. When the killings came, prosecutors faced a different kind of failure: how to convict a man who wasn't physically there. The Helter Skelter motive offered a perfect solution. It transformed Manson into prophet and his followers into instruments, turning words into weapons and belief into a criminal act. But not everyone inside the district attorney's office agreed. Aaron Stovitz, the original lead prosecutor, expressed doubts about the theory's credibility and was removed from the case. Vincent Bugliosi took over, ambitious, intense, and determined to build a single story strong enough to win in court and in the court of public opinion. From that moment, the courtroom became a stage, and Bugliosi its author. He courted reporters, briefed television crews daily, and, even before the verdict, signed a contract ensuring his version would be the one the public remembered. That contract, signed while the jury was still hearing evidence, guaranteed him a national platform. The resulting book, Helter Skelter, would sell millions and define the case for generations. Colleagues later testified that Bugliosi's pursuit of publicity was relentless. For him, conviction and celebrity had become the same prize. The more sensational the motive, the better it worked. For the jury, for the cameras, and for the book that would soon follow. The Helter Skelter theory wasn't just courtroom strategy. It was the first draft of a bestseller. There's one question that still shadows this entire case. Why did the state need to tie Charles Manson to the murders at all? Legally, the answer was simple. Without him, the case would fall apart. The people who physically committed the killings, Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, Van Houten were a loose collection of small-time criminals. Without a unifying hand to bind them, the prosecution faced 4 separate murders with no common motive. Conspiracy charges were the only way to make them one story. But politically, there was even more at stake. Los Angeles in 1969 was spiraling. Racial tension, riots, an unpopular war, a counterculture the establishment no longer understood. The city needed control, and the country needed a villain. When Manson appeared, wild-eyed, unrepentant, preaching chaos, he became the perfect symbol of everything Middle America feared. By making him the architect, the state could put the entire decade on trial. And then came personal ambition. Vincent Bugliosi didn't just need a conviction, he needed a legacy. A garden-variety drug killing wouldn't build one, but an apocalyptic race war, foretold by the Beatles and masterminded by a charismatic drifter? That was history, and a headline. So they built a case that demanded belief, not just evidence. A narrative large enough to convict every defendant and sanctify the man who prosecuted them. The Helter Skelter story wasn't created because it was true. It was created because it was useful. The early witness statements show no trace of apocalypse, but plenty of evidence of drugs. The victims at Cielo Drive were deeply entangled in Hollywood's narcotics economy. Jay Sebring, known in celebrity circles as the Candy Man, supplied cocaine to clients. Wojciech Frykowski used and dealt. Just hours before the murders, dealer Joel Rostow reportedly delivered mescaline and cocaine to the house. Meanwhile, the Manson family lived in that same underworld. A month earlier, on July 1, 1969, Manson shot dealer Bernard Lotzapapa Crow in a failed robbery. Believing Crow dead and fearing retribution from the Black Panthers, Manson armed his followers and fortified Spahn Ranch. It was fear, not prophecy, that ruled them. That siege mentality explains far more than mysticism ever could. A band of criminals on the edge, watching their world collapse and striking out before someone else did. Weeks later, they rehearsed the pattern. On July 27th, Bobby Beausoleil, joined by Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner, tortured and killed Gary Hinman over a botched mescaline deal. Manson himself arrived mid-attack and slashed Hinman's face with a sword. When it was over, they scrawled "Political Piggy" on the wall in blood and added a Black Panther symbol, deliberate misdirection. Less than 2 weeks later, Beausoleil was arrested driving Hinman's car. The family panicked. One of their own was in jail, and the trail led straight back to the ranch. 2 nights later came Cielo Drive. The next night, the LaBianca home on Waverly Drive. Both scenes repeated Hinman's staging: words, blood, slogans. The timeline suggests no prophecy at all, only imitation and desperation. The crimes were copycat performances designed to confuse police and protect Beausoleil by creating the illusion of a political killing spree. When arranged chronologically, the logic is simple. July 1st, Manson shoots Crow, fears revenge. July 27th, Hinman killed, scene staged with political graffiti. August 6th, Beausoleil arrested with Hinman's car and weapon. August 9th to 10th, Cielo Drive and the LaBianca home echo the same method. It's not mysticism, it's damage control. A failed musician facing humiliation, a drug crew under pressure, and a desperate attempt to muddy the evidence. The simpler story fit the facts, but not the courtroom. It could convict the killers who held the knives, but not the man who commanded them. The Helter Skelter theory solved that problem, stretching motive into ideology and ideology into conspiracy. It gave Bugliosi the through line he needed and the drama the public craved. The media rewarded it instantly. For a nation reeling from the end of the 60s, Helter Skelter turned confusion into closure. Manson became the face of a fallen generation, and Bugliosi became the man who stopped him. And so, the powerful, coherent narrative of Helter Skelter begins to show its cracks. We now have a new set of motives, grounded not in apocalyptic prophecy, but in the desperate realities of Los Angeles's criminal underworld. Drug burns, financial pressure, organized rivalries, and a chaotic copycat killing. Simpler, more logical explanations for the violence at Cielo Drive and Waverly. But as the evidence points one way, history points another. If these competing theories were known to investigators, why did Helter Skelter become the only story the world would ever hear? How did a small-time career criminal, who wasn't even at the crime scene, become the 20th century's icon of evil? There's another layer to this story, one most people never want to face, because if it's true, it changes everything we thought we knew about evil, control, and accountability. It isn't mysticism, it isn't prophecy, it's policy. Cold, signed, stamped. To see it, we have to enter the hidden world that built it, a world called Project MKUltra. MKUltra wasn't rumor. It grew from earlier projects like Artichoke, which explored whether a person could be made to involuntarily perform an act of assassination. It became a vast CIA program devoted to controlling behavior and erasing memory. Born of Cold War panic and the illusion that the human mind could be rewritten like magnetic tape. Through Operation Paperclip, America imported Nazi scientists from Dachau and Ravensbrück. They brought notebooks, and America brought funding. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized chemist Sidney Gottlieb to run MKUltra. 80 universities, hospitals, and prisons joined the web. Stanford, Harvard, McGill, even small local hospitals that never knew who truly paid the bills. The methods read like a horror index. High-dose LSD, electroshock, sensory deprivation, hypnosis layered on trauma. Patients believed they were receiving treatment. In truth, they were being erased. At McGill University, Dr. Ewan Cameron subjected patients to weeks of psychic driving. Recordings looped in their ears while they lay drugged and restrained. In San Francisco, Operation Midnight Climax disguised CIA safe houses as brothels, so agents could watch men through one-way mirrors after dosing them. Across more than 150 fronts, researchers studied hypnosis, isolation, and toxic chemicals, all asking the same question: could a person be forced to act against their will and forget? Declassified 1955 memos listed the goals: promote illogical thinking, increase dependency, and induce amnesia. Subjects were often prisoners or psychiatric inmates, people who couldn't refuse, already broken. Exactly the kind of man Charles Manson was. During the years Manson moved through the prison system, MKUltra was in full operation, testing drugs and psychological conditioning behind institutional walls. Prisons and psychiatric hospitals made ideal laboratories, controlled populations, minimal oversight, and endless human subjects. One of those facilities was the California Medical Facility, the state's psychiatric prison at Vacaville. It was built for inmates considered too unstable for ordinary custody. Long before Vacaville, Manson had lived inside institutions, trained by structure, shaped by survival. By the time he was transferred there for what doctors called a deteriorating mental condition, he was already fractured. Vacaville's public mission was rehabilitation. Behind closed doors, it became something else. In the early 1960s, the facility admitted to using thousands of inmates in chemical and medical experiments, including pesticide and drug trials. During those same years, CIA-funded psychiatrist Dr. James Hamilton tested what he called behavioral control materials, code for LSD and psychochemicals, on prisoners already involved in those studies. It was the perfect intersection, the criminal underclass meeting the intelligence community's obsession with control, a laboratory wearing the mask of reform. Years later, when Watergate threatened exposure, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the program's records destroyed. The evidence burned, but the idea that behavior could be engineered survived. The trail leads to one man, Dr. Louis Jolyon West, nicknamed Jolly. He studied brainwashing in Korean War POWs, examined Jack Ruby after he shot Oswald, and later diagnosed Patricia Hearst following her ideological conversion. Whenever politics met psychology, West appeared with a clipboard. A documented MKUltra contractor, he submitted CIA proposals describing how drugs and hypnosis could implant false memories. His curiosity didn't stop at people. He once injected an elephant with an overdose of LSD to study psychosis. The animal died within minutes. West called the result inconclusive. By 1967, he operated out of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, officially studying the hippie scene, unofficially embedding the agency's leading mind control expert at the heart of America's youth movement. A later CIA review admitted West was there purportedly at the behest of the agency. The crossroads was the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Manson was treated there. His parole officer Roger Smith worked there. Dr. West conducted studies there. Founder Dr. David Smith later confirmed that West could recruit subjects. Roger Smith, no relation, ran an amphetamine research project. Most parole officers managed 40 cases. Roger Smith had one. Manson. Arrests for assault, theft, and trafficking minors vanished into paperwork. When local supervisors tried to intervene, Washington, D.C. overruled them. Roger Smith wasn't a parole officer. He was a handler, an institutional firewall protecting an active operation. Days after the Tate-LaBianca murders, police raided Spawn Ranch and arrested everyone. It should have ended there. Instead, the entire group was released. The warrant, they said, was misdated. Each glitch alone could be written off as error. Together they start to look like design. Soon after, a key phone call from Bobby Beausoleil disappeared from evidence. Then came Reeve Whitson, an alleged intelligence operative with ties from the CIA to Hollywood. A friend of Jay Sebring, acquainted with Polanski, orbiting Manson himself. Photographer Shahrokh Hatami testified that Whitson phoned him about the murders 90 minutes before police were notified. He later appeared during witness interviews, reportedly working with prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi to pressure testimonies. That isn't civic duty. That's cleanup. If chaos was the product, who profited? The answer may lie with COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program. Its mission: expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize domestic groups deemed subversive. Targets included civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers, and student activists. Tactics ranged from forged letters and planted stories to provoking violence between factions. One memo ordered agents to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify the movement. Another bragged that internal feuds and paranoia were accomplishing objectives. Under COINTELPRO, the Black Panthers were infiltrated until they imploded. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee collapsed under manipulation. Martin Luther King Jr. was wiretapped and blackmailed. And when the Manson murders dominated headlines, public faith in the counterculture evaporated. Flower children became potential cultists. Peace rallies looked like threats. Hoover didn't need to invent a new operation. He'd been handed the perfect one. Whether or not intelligence directly touched Manson, the result fulfilled COINTELPRO's objectives: a frightened nation and a generation discredited. MKUltra fractured the mind. COINTELPRO fractured the movement. The Manson case sat squarely between the two. We end with 3 versions of the same story. The official account: a charismatic cult leader, a doomsday fantasy, justice served. The criminal account: a drug dispute and small-time criminals spinning into violence. And the institutional account: a human experiment that escaped containment. Critics argue the institutional version is circumstantial. No smoking gun memo linking Manson to the program. But that objection ignores something undeniable. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered nearly all MKUltra records destroyed. To demand proof from an archive deliberately incinerated is to set an impossible standard. The gun, and the hand that held it, were turned to ash. What remains is uncomfortable. Charles Manson was shaped, sustained, and released by systems already testing how far the mind could bend. When we call him a monster, we may be complimenting his creators. The Manson case forces us to look beyond one man's madness to the machinery that manufactured fear. That machinery had another name: COINTELPRO. Next, we open that file. The FBI's secret war against its own citizens. From Martin Luther King to the Black Panthers. From students to ordinary Americans who simply asked questions. We'll give the Bureau its fair shake, its motives, its fears, and ask the question it never wanted on record. How far can a democracy go to protect itself before it becomes the thing it fears? To make sure you don't miss our next investigation, please subscribe or follow the Fairshake Files on your favorite platform. The series is available as both a video documentary on YouTube and as a podcast on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all major platforms. We welcome your thoughts. Leave a comment or a review to join the conversation. Thank you for watching and listening.